You are a blight on this community, Mr. Henderson. An unsightly, commercial blight, and it will stop. Those were the words she used. Not, could we discuss your stand, or, I'm not sure that's allowed. No, it was a declaration of war, delivered with the self-assured finality of a queen condemning a peasant. I just stood there, holding a perfectly ripe tomato, the scent of earth and sunshine clinging to my hands, and watched her march away, her beige pantsuit cutting a rigid path back toward her oversized beige house. Blight. That word echoed in my head. I had come to this place, this little pocket of manicured lawns and faux Tuscan villas called Willow Creek Estates, for the opposite of blight. I came seeking green, seeking soil, seeking peace. My wife, Eleanor, had passed 2 years prior, and the city, with its noise and its concrete and its suffocating memories, had become unbearable. Our life had been a symphony of shared moments, and now all I could hear was the silence where our harmony used to be. So, I sold our life's work, a successful agricultural consulting firm, and bought this 5-acre plot on the edge of the development. It was the perfect compromise, or so I thought. It had an old but solid farmhouse, a sturdy barn, and 3 acres of rich, loamy soil that hadn't been touched by anything but weeds for a decade. It was a blank canvas. It was my escape. My profession, for 40 years, had been the science of growth. I advised multinational corporations on crop yields, soil health, and sustainable farming practices. I'd spent my life in labs and on vast, industrial farms, dealing in futures and logistics. Now, all I wanted was to feel the dirt under my own fingernails. I wanted to grow things for the simple joy of it, to watch a seed become sustenance. The farm stand was an afterthought, really. I had planted far too much that first spring. My counters were overflowing with heirloom tomatoes, my baskets were bursting with zucchini, and the sweet corn was piling up in the barn. It was a harvest born of grief-fueled energy. So, I built a simple stand out of reclaimed barn wood, set it at the end of my long driveway, and put up a small, hand-painted sign, Henderson's Harvest. I used an old cash box in the honor system. It wasn't about profit, it was about sharing the quiet joy that my land was giving me. And people loved it. They'd leave crumpled dollar bills and sometimes little notes. Best tomatoes I've ever had, or my kids devoured the strawberries in the car on the way home. It connected me to this new place in a small, gentle way. It was a fragile root I was putting down in unfamiliar soil. Then came Carol. Carol Miller was the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I learned later that this was a position she held with the grim tenacity of a dictator clinging to power. She was a woman who seemed to be perpetually wound one turn too tight, her smile a thin, painted line that never reached her eyes. Her authority was absolute within the beige walls of the development, and my little farm stand, apparently, was a declaration of independence she could not tolerate. Her first visit was a week after I opened. She'd pulled her golf cart, the official chariot of HOA royalty, to a stop at the end of my drive, eyeing my humble stand as if it were a pile of hazardous waste. She didn't get out. She just stared, her lips pursed into a little knot of disapproval, and then sped off. I'd shrugged it off. Some people are just wound tight. The letter arrived 2 days later. It was thick, creamy cardstock, embossed with the Willow Creek logo. It spoke of bylaws and covenants, of maintaining aesthetic harmony and property values. It cited Section 14, Article B, Paragraph 3, no commercial enterprises shall be conducted on any residential lot. My stand was to be dismantled immediately. A fine of $50 per day would be levied for noncompliance. I read it, sighed, and filed it away. My property wasn't technically part of the residential lots covered by that covenant. My 5 acres were zoned agricultural residential, a little island of old-world zoning that predated the existence of Willow Creek Estates. The developer had simply built around my plot. I knew this because I had done my due diligence. I was a methodical man. It was the core of my being, the bedrock of my career. I did nothing. The stand remained. The zucchini continued to multiply with terrifying speed. That's what led to her blight declaration. She had returned, this time on foot, her sensible walking shoes making no sound on my gravel driveway. She was a predator stalking her prey. "Did you receive the letter?" she had demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I did," I said calmly, polishing a bell pepper on my shirt. "Good morning to you, too." It wasn't a suggestion, Mr. Henderson. It was a formal notice of violation. Your stand is an unauthorized commercial enterprise. Well, I'm not so sure about that, I'd replied, trying to keep things neighborly. My property isn't actually under the HOA's jurisdiction for this sort of thing. The zoning is a bit different. I checked before I started. Her face tightened. It was the look of a person who had never been told she was wrong. It was like watching a computer freeze. Her programming had no protocol for this response. That is absurd, she sputtered. Every home in this community is under our authority. My home isn't technically in the community, I explained patiently. It's adjacent to it. I don't pay HOA fees, and my deed doesn't include the covenants you're referring to. This was the moment the logic circuits in her brain completely shorted out. Her face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. That's when she delivered her verdict. I was a blight. And the blight would be removed. I watched her stomp away and felt a familiar weariness settle over me. I had come here to escape conflict, to live out my days in quiet communion with the earth. But it seemed conflict, like a stubborn weed, could sprout in even the most carefully tended gardens. I didn't know it then, but Carol had just tilled the soil for her own destruction. And my harvest, I decided, was going to be a bitter one for her. The escalation began subtly, then rapidly devolved into a campaign of petty warfare. A few days after our confrontation, the official Willow Creek monthly newsletter arrived. Tucked between an announcement for the community potluck and a reminder about keeping garbage cans out of sight was a pointed little article written by Carol herself. It was titled, "Preserving Our Community's Character." It spoke of the dangers of unregulated commercial activity and transient traffic being drawn into their safe, quiet enclave. It didn't mention me by name, but it described a ramshackle roadside stall at the community's entrance, hinting at potential health code violations and the risk of attracting undesirable elements. Ramshackle. I looked at my stand. I had built it with my own hands from 100-year-old oak I'd salvaged from the barn. It was simple, yes, but it was solid and clean. It had character. What her little beige kingdom lacked. I felt a prickle of annoyance. This was a public shaming, a way to turn my new neighbors against me before I even had a chance to meet them. The honor system cash box was still working, but I noticed a few cars slowing down, their drivers peering at my stand with suspicion before speeding away. The seed of doubt had been planted. Then the fines started arriving daily. Each one a crisp, new envelope in my mailbox, a $50 penalty for my continued defiance. I stacked them neatly on my kitchen counter. They were building into a monument of her absurdity. One afternoon, I was weeding my tomato plants when a county sheriff's deputy pulled up my drive. He was a young man, looked barely out of his teens, with a nervous energy about him. He got out of his car, adjusting his belt. "Afternoon, sir," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm responding to a complaint." "Let me guess," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "It's about the farm stand." He looked relieved. "Yes, sir. A complaint was filed about an illegal business operation and, creating a public nuisance." He looked from his notepad to my peaceful, tidy stand and back again, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "The stand is on my property, which is zoned for it," I explained, for what felt like the 100th time. "I have all the county permits right here." I walked over to the stand and pulled a plastic sleeve from beneath the counter containing my business license and the relevant zoning documents. The deputy reviewed them, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read them once, then twice. "Well, everything here looks to be in order, Mr. Henderson. These permits are all valid." "I figured as much," I said. "The complaint came from the HOA president, didn't it? A woman named Carol Miller." He gave a weary sigh that seemed too old for his young face. "We get a lot of calls from her," he admitted, lowering his voice slightly. "Reports of unapproved flower bed colors, kids playing too loudly, that sort of thing. Sorry to have bothered you." "No bother at all, officer. Thanks for stopping by." He left, and I watched his car disappear down the road. This was her new tactic, using public resources to harass me. It was a classic bully move. When your own power isn't enough, you try to leverage the power of others. It was inefficient, and it was pathetic. But it was also draining. The turning point, The moment my patient frustration curdled into cold resolve, came a week later. It was a Saturday morning, my busiest day. Families would often stop by after soccer practice. I enjoyed seeing the kids, their eyes wide as they picked out their own vegetables. That morning, a woman and her young daughter, who couldn't have been more than 6, were at the stand. The little girl was carefully selecting a pint of cherry tomatoes, her face a mask of serious concentration. Suddenly, Carol's golf cart screeched to a halt beside them. She didn't speak to me. She addressed the customer, her voice dripping with condescending concern. "Ma'am, I feel I have a responsibility to warn you," Carol said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This operation is unsanctioned. We have no idea what kind of chemicals or pesticides he's using on this produce. It could be unsafe for your child." The mother froze, her hand hovering over a basket of green beans. She looked from Carol's smug face to me, then down at her daughter, who was now clutching the cherry tomatoes to her chest as if to protect them. I felt a surge of white-hot anger, something I hadn't felt since Eleanor got her diagnosis. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was a direct attack on my integrity, on my life's work. She was using a child to make her point. I walked slowly toward them, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I forced myself to unclench them. "Carol," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Everything I grow here is organic. I've spent my entire career promoting safe, sustainable agriculture. You, on the other hand, have a lawn service that sprays enough chemicals to sterilize a small country every other Tuesday." The mother's eyes widened. Carol's face went pale, then blotchy with rage. "How dare you? You are endangering this community." "No," I said, taking another step closer. "You are. You're poisoning the groundwater with your perfect lawn, and you're poisoning the community with your baseless accusations. Now, I'm going to ask you to leave my property." The mother, caught in the crossfire, quickly paid for her tomatoes, grabbed her daughter's hand, and scurried back to her car. The little girl looked back at me with wide, frightened eyes. That was it. The line had been crossed. My quest for a quiet life was officially over. Carol Miller had mistaken my patience for weakness. She thought she was just pruning an unsightly branch, but she had just taken an axe to the wrong tree. Now, she was going to find out what happens when you disturb the roots. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the stack of her ridiculous finds mocking me from the counter. My peaceful retirement had become a battlefield, and I had been a passive defender for too long. It was time to go on the offensive. I was a scientist. A problem solver. And Carol Miller was now the most fascinating problem I had ever encountered. I needed data. I needed to understand the system she operated within, to find its vulnerabilities, its pressure points. My new project had begun. Project Nightingale, I decided to call it, after the old saying about revenge. My first step was a deep dive into the Willow Creek HOA. I spent the next day on the county clerk's website, pulling every public document I could find, the original articles of incorporation, the bylaws, the meeting minutes for the last 5 years, and the annual financial statements. I printed everything, spreading the pages across my large dining room table until it looked like a general's campaign map. The bylaws were as restrictive as I'd imagined, a petty tyrant's dream of absolute control. But the financial statements were where things got interesting. They were sloppy. Vague line items like community enhancement and vendor services accounted for tens of thousands of dollars, with no detailed breakdowns. For an organization obsessed with the precise shade of beige a mailbox could be painted, their bookkeeping was remarkably imprecise. My eyes kept returning to one particular event, the weekly farmers market. It was held every Saturday in the pristine little park next to the community clubhouse. According to the newsletter, it was Carol's proudest achievement, a symbol of Willow Creek's commitment to fresh, local living. The HOA's financials showed a significant weekly expenditure for the market, paid to a single entity, Green Valley Provisions. I'd never heard of them. A quick search revealed they were a food distributor, a middleman, based in a town 40 miles away. That struck me as odd. Why would a community farmers market, supposedly celebrating local growers, source all its produce from a distributor that far away? Why weren't local farmers like me invited to participate? The answer, I suspected, lay somewhere in that vague vendor services line item. My investigation needed to move from the digital to the physical. The next Saturday, I left my own stand in the care of a trusted neighbor's teenage son and drove over to the Willow Creek Farmers Market for the first time. It was exactly as advertised, a collection of pristine white tents, happy families milling about, and tables piled high with beautiful, picture-perfect produce. It was almost too perfect. The bell peppers were all uniformly shaped, the tomatoes were all the exact same shade of red, and the lettuce heads were identical clones of one another. This wasn't the chaotic, beautifully imperfect bounty of a collection of local farms. This was the curated, standardized output of a major commercial operation. It was agricultural theater. I walked up to a stall and picked up a tomato. It was firm and blemish-free. It was also completely odorless. I knew this tomato. I'd spent decades working with growers who produced fruit like this. It was bred for durability and long-distance shipping, not for flavor. Carol was there, of course, holding court near the entrance. She was beaming, accepting praise from residents for the market's success. She saw me, and her smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure venom. I gave her a small, polite nod and continued my reconnaissance. I bought a few items, a basket of strawberries, some corn, a zucchini, and took them home. Back in my kitchen, which had once been a place of culinary peace and now felt like a forensics lab, I examined my purchases. The zucchini was a standard Black Beauty variety, identical to the ones I grew. The corn was a peaches and cream hybrid, also in my field. The strawberries were the Albion variety, known for being sturdy but not particularly sweet. I grew them, too. A strange suspicion began to form in my mind. It was a wild, almost unbelievable hypothesis. But in my line of work, the wildest hypotheses were sometimes the ones that bore fruit. I needed to know more about Green Valley Provisions. I found their number and called, pretending to be a new restaurant owner in the area looking for a supplier. The woman on the phone was friendly and helpful. I asked about their sourcing. "Oh, we get our produce from a variety of farms," she said. "But our premium organic line, the stuff we supply to specialty markets, that comes almost exclusively from one of our best local partners." "Really?" I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "I'm looking for high-quality, local stuff." "Who is this partner?" "I'm sorry, our supplier agreements are confidential," she said. "But I can tell you he's located out your way, near Willow Creek. A small, independent farm with some of the best soil in the state." My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. "Let me ask you this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you happen to have a contract with the Willow Creek Estates HOA market?" "We sure do," she said proudly. "That's one of our best accounts. The president, Carol Miller, is very particular. She only wants the best for her community." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a tectonic shift. It was an elegant, audacious, and utterly infuriating puzzle. For the past 40 years, a significant portion of my income had come from a side business I ran with Eleanor. We had developed several unique, high-yield, and disease-resistant heirloom vegetable varieties. We licensed the seeds to a select few commercial growers. Our biggest and most trusted licensee was a man named George, who ran a large organic farm about 20 miles from my new home. He was a good man, a farmer of the old school who valued quality above all else. He was also, I suddenly realized, a primary supplier for Green Valley Provisions. I pulled up my licensing records. I looked at George's recent planting schedules and harvest reports. The varieties, the timing, the volume, it all matched. The zucchini Carol's market was selling was my proprietary Emerald Star hybrid. The tomatoes were my Crimson Sun heirlooms. The corn was my Honeysilk bicolor. I was the best local partner. My produce was being trucked from George's farm to Green Valley Provisions, 40 miles away. It was then marked up significantly and sold back to the Willow Creek HOA, to be displayed in a market less than a mile from the very fields where similar crops were growing. And the woman trying to shut down my unsightly farm stand, the woman accusing me of selling unsafe food, was unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, the biggest customer of my life's work. The irony was so thick I could have bottled it and sold it at my stand. This discovery changed everything. This wasn't just a petty feud anymore. This was a case of staggering hypocrisy, and I suspected, financial malfeasance. There was no logical reason for this convoluted supply chain unless someone was benefiting from it. And my prime suspect was the Queen of Willow Creek herself. Carol was getting a kickback. It was the only explanation that made sense. My plan, which had been a vague concept of defending my rights, now crystallized into a sharp, focused weapon. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to orchestrate a downfall of biblical proportions. I was going to give Carol Miller a practical, hands-on lesson in the principles of cause and effect. Poetic justice was on the menu, and I was about to serve it cold. The first phase of my plan was simple: gather irrefutable proof. Hypothesis without data is just speculation. I needed evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, that would leave no room for doubt or denial. I started by calling George, my old licensee. We hadn't spoken in a few months, but our relationship was built on decades of mutual respect. "Frank. Good to hear from you," his booming voice came through the phone. "How's retirement treating you? Heard you bought the old Henderson place. Good land, that." "It's treating me well, George." "Mostly," I said. "Listen, I have a strange question for you. Do you do much business with a distributor called Green Valley Provisions?" There was a slight pause. "Yeah, they're one of my biggest buyers," he said, a note of caution in his voice. "Why do you ask?" "They supply a farmer's market in my neighborhood," I explained. "And I have a strong suspicion they're selling your produce there, specifically, the varieties you license from me." George let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be. That's a roundabout way to get your own tomatoes back. They buy a truckload of your Crimson Suns from me every week." "Here's what I need, George," I said, getting to the point. "I need you to help me prove it. I'm dealing with a difficult situation here. The head of our HOA is trying to shut down my little farm stand, and I think there's something rotten going on with her and this distributor." George was a man who had no patience for bullies or bureaucrats. "Say no more, Frank. Anything you need. Invoices, shipping manifests, you name it. That woman sounds like a piece of work. Trying to shut down a man selling his own produce from his own land. That ain't right." He was my first ally. Within an hour, my email inbox was flooded with documents from George. Scanned copies of every purchase order from Green Valley Provisions for the last 6 months, detailing the exact quantities and varieties of my proprietary produce. Shipping manifests confirming deliveries. It was a perfect paper trail leading from my intellectual property, through George's farm, to the distributor. The next step was to connect the distributor to Carol. This required a more delicate touch. I installed a small, high-definition security camera, disguised as a birdhouse, on a tree with a clear view of my farm stand and the road. It was motion-activated and recorded crystal-clear audio. Legally, in my state, I was allowed to record conversations on my own property, especially in a publicly accessible area like the end of my driveway. This wasn't about entrapment, it was about documentation. I then decided to set a little trap. A controlled experiment. One of my most popular items was a unique variety of sweet pepper I developed called the Sun-Kissed Belle. It was bright orange, incredibly sweet, and George was the only farmer in the entire state licensed to grow it commercially. According to his records, Green Valley bought 20 bushels of them every week for the Willow Creek market. I called George with an idea. "For the next 2 weeks," I said, "I need you to tell Green Valley you have a crop failure on the Sun-Kissed Belles. A blight, a pest, whatever you want to call it. Tell them you can't supply any." George chuckled. "I see where you're going with this, Frank. You're going to starve them out. Consider it done." Then, I did something I'd never done before. I put up a big sign at my farm stand: "Fresh this week, exclusive Sun-Kissed Belle peppers. Limited supply." I piled my entire personal harvest of the peppers on the stand. They glowed like little orange lanterns in the afternoon sun. I was creating a monopoly. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the quarry to walk into it. It didn't take long. The following Saturday, the Willow Creek Farmers Market was conspicuously devoid of its signature orange peppers. I learned later from a sympathetic neighbor that several residents had asked Carol about them, and she had become flustered, blaming supply chain issues. Meanwhile, my stand was doing a roaring trade. Car after car stopped, the occupants drawn in by my sign. I sold out of the sun-kissed bells in 2 hours. One of the customers was a woman from the HOA board, a quiet lady named Martha who had always seemed intimidated by Carol. She bought a bag of the peppers, her eyes flicking nervously toward the main road as if she expected Carol to appear at any moment. "These look wonderful, Mr. Henderson," she whispered. "We couldn't find any at the market today." "Fresh from the field this morning," I said with a smile. "Funny how that works, isn't it? The real prize came on Monday." My birdhouse camera sent an alert to my phone. I watched the live feed as Carol's golf cart pulled up. She didn't get out. She sat there, staring at my stand, where a new sign read, "Sold out of sun-kissed peppers. More next week." Her face was a thundercloud. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Thanks to the camera's sensitive microphone, I heard every word. "Yes, this is Carol Miller," she snapped into the phone. "I'm calling about my order. I need to speak to someone in charge." "No, I will not hold." There was a pause. "Listen to me," she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "Our contract specifies 20 bushels of the orange bell peppers every week. For 2 weeks now, you've sent none. My residents are complaining. This is unacceptable." She listened for a moment, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "A crop failure? I don't believe that for a second. Do you know who I am? The Willow Creek Market is your most prestigious account. You find me those peppers, or I will find a new supplier. And believe me, you do not want me talking to my friend on the board of Green Valley about your incompetence." She slammed her phone down and sped away in a cloud of dust and indignation. I saved the video file and labeled it, Exhibit A. It was perfect. She had confirmed her direct involvement in the market's procurement, her specific demand for my proprietary product, and she had even hinted at a cozy, unprofessional relationship with the distributor's management. She was digging her own grave, and I was happily handing her the shovel. The next HOA meeting was my target. It was the arena where she held all the power, where her word was law. It was time to introduce a new variable into her carefully controlled environment, the truth. I wasn't going to reveal everything at once. That wasn't my style. A scientist reveals their findings in stages, building a case piece by piece until the conclusion is inescapable. This was just the first reveal, the presentation of the initial data. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of air freshener and quiet desperation. About 30 residents were scattered amongst the chairs, most looking bored. On a raised platform at the front sat Carol and her 2 board members, Martha and a stern-looking man named Bob. Carol ran through the agenda with brisk, self-important efficiency. Then she arrived at new business. "As you all know," she began, her eyes scanning the room, "we have been dealing with a persistent issue regarding an unauthorized, unsightly commercial stall at the entrance to our community." She paused for dramatic effect, her gaze landing on me where I sat in the back row. "This individual," she continued, not using my name, as if I were a contagion, "has refused to comply with our community standards. He has ignored our notices, flouted our bylaws, and continues to operate his illegal business in defiance of this association's authority. This lowers our property values and poses a potential risk to our families." She was painting me as an outlaw, a threat to their suburban paradise. I let her finish, let her dig the hole just a little bit deeper. "Therefore," she concluded, "I am proposing a motion to authorize the board to seek a legal injunction to have this nuisance forcibly removed. All in favor?" Before anyone could raise a hand, I stood up. "Point of information, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear in the quiet room. Carol's eyes narrowed. "You are not a member of this association, Mr. Henderson. You have no right to speak." "Actually, I do," I said, holding up a copy of the HOA's own bylaws. "According to Article 3, Section 4, non-member residents of adjacent properties may be granted the floor to address issues that directly affect them. And since you're proposing to spend the association's money on a lawsuit against me, I believe this qualifies." A murmur went through the room. I had read her own rulebook back to her. She was momentarily stunned. Bob, the other board member, leaned over and whispered something to her. She scowled but gave a curt nod. "Fine," she spat. "You have 2 minutes." "Thank you," I said, walking slowly to the front of the room. I didn't have notes. I had facts. First, I began, addressing the residents, not her. I'd like to correct the record. My farm stand is not illegal. It is fully licensed and permitted by the county and operates on land that is not subject to the HOA's covenants. The sheriff's department has already confirmed this. Another murmur. This was news to them. They had only heard her side of the story. Second, the stand is not a nuisance. It's a place where many of you, I said, making eye contact with a few people I recognized from the stand, have purchased fresh, locally grown, organic produce for your families. Produce grown right here, in your own backyard, so to speak. I let that sink in. Now, I have a question for the board, I said, turning my attention to Carol. It's about our community's own farmers market. A wonderful initiative, and I'm sure we all appreciate the effort that goes into it. Carol looked suspicious, but I was praising her pet project, so she was caught off guard. I'm just curious about the produce you sell there, I continued. The newsletters describe it as fresh and local, but I've learned that it's all supplied by a single distributor, Green Valley Provisions, which is located 40 miles away. That doesn't seem very local to me. The residents started looking at each other. They'd all assumed, as intended, that the market featured a variety of local farmers. Furthermore, I said, pressing my advantage, I've noticed a distinct lack of certain popular items recently. For instance, those lovely orange bell peppers. I was told by the supplier that there was a crop failure. Is that your understanding, Carol? I said her name directly, and she flinched as if struck. All eyes in the room were now on her. Her reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. She didn't respond with a calm, businesslike explanation. She exploded. This is outrageous, she shrieked, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. This has nothing to do with you. You are trying to divert attention from your own violations. It's a simple question, I said evenly. The residents are paying a premium for what they believe is local produce. I'm just asking for a little transparency. Where does the food actually come from? And why is it being trucked in from 40 miles away when there's a farm? I gestured vaguely in the direction of my property, right next door. The logistics of the market are none of your business, she yelled, her face turning a familiar shade of blotchy red. Green Valley is a reputable supplier. They provide us with excellent quality. Excellent quality, yes, I agreed. I should know. The sun-kissed bell pepper they can no longer seem to get. That's my pepper. I developed it. I hold the patent. And the only commercial grower in this state is a man I license it to. The reason Green Valley can't get it is because he's having a crop failure, but as you can see, I said, turning back to the residents, my personal crop, grown from the same seeds, is doing just fine. I sold out of them at my unsightly stand last weekend. The room fell into a stunned silence. You could hear the gears turning in everyone's heads. They were connecting the dots. Carol stood there, speechless, opening and closing her mouth like a fish. She had been publicly humiliated, her narrative shattered by a few simple, verifiable facts. She had lost control, and for a woman like Carol, loss of control is a fate worse than death. This meeting is adjourned, she finally managed to screech, banging a gavel that wasn't there. She then gathered her papers and stormed out of the room, leaving her fellow board members and the confused residents in her wake. I had won the battle, but I knew the war was far from over. I had exposed a crack in her authority, but I hadn't dismantled the structure. Her reaction, pure, undiluted rage, told me she was cornered. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Her retaliation, I knew, would be swift, vicious, and aimed directly at my heart. I went home that night not with a sense of triumph, but with the cold, clear understanding that I had just lit the fuse on a much larger bomb. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate. Carol's public meltdown had cost her credibility. Neighbors who had previously avoided my gaze now gave me hesitant smiles or a thumbs up as they drove by. Martha, the timid board member, even stopped at my stand to buy some green beans and quietly apologize for Carol's behavior. None of us knew, she whispered. We just trusted her. But I knew Carol wasn't the type to retreat and lick her wounds. She was the type to burn the entire forest down to get at her enemy. Her retaliation began 2 days later, and it was far more insidious than I could have imagined. It started with an anonymous post on the official Willow Creek community social media page. The post, written in breathless, concerned parent language, warned residents about a certain farm stand and questioned the safety of its produce. It insinuated that I might be using banned pesticides from Mexico and that my well water could be contaminated. It was a masterpiece of baseless fear-mongering, designed to poison the well of public opinion, literally. The comments section exploded. Some defended me, but many others were swayed by the panic. I let my kids eat his strawberries. Should I be worried? One person wrote. Someone needs to call the health department, wrote another. Which, of course, they did. The very next day, a stern-looking inspector from the county health department showed up at my farm. He had a file in his hand. We've received multiple anonymous complaints, he said, his tone grim. Allegations of unsanitary conditions, use of illegal chemicals, and selling contaminated produce. This was a serious escalation. An HOA dispute was one thing. A formal health investigation could destroy my reputation and potentially my livelihood, even if I was cleared. I have nothing to hide, I told him. I spent the next 3 hours walking him through my entire operation. I showed him my immaculate packing shed, my records of organic seed purchases, my state-of-the-art water filtration system for the well, and the logbooks detailing my entirely organic pest control methods. I was a scientist. Documentation was my native language. The inspector was thorough, taking water samples, soil samples, and swabbing surfaces. As he worked, he started to relax. You know, he said, looking at my pristine records, it's not often I see a small operation this well organized. You run a tighter ship than most of the big commercial farms I inspect. By the end of the day, he was practically apologetic. I'm sorry to have taken up your time, Mr. Henderson. I have to file my report, but I can tell you right now, these complaints are baseless. There isn't a single violation here. Frankly, this is one of the cleanest farms I've ever seen. I was cleared, but the damage was done. The seed of fear Carol had planted was taking root. Sales at my stand dropped by half. The friendly waves from neighbors became looks of suspicion once again. But she wasn't done. A week later, I received a certified letter from a law firm. Carol, using HOA funds, had filed a frivolous lawsuit against me for creating a public nuisance and diminishing property values. It was a classic slap suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, designed not to win, but to bleed me dry with legal fees. This was her endgame. If she couldn't beat me with rules or rumors, she would try to bankrupt me. She was leveraging the community's money to settle her personal vendetta. This vicious, all-out assault was precisely the final push I needed. My methodical plan had been about exposing a hypocrite. Now, it was about removing a cancer from the community before it destroyed everything. I needed more than just circumstantial evidence and public opinion. I needed a smoking gun. I needed a whistleblower. My thoughts turned to Green Valley Provisions. Carol had threatened them on that recorded phone call. She had a friend on the board. This suggested a relationship that went beyond a simple customer-supplier dynamic. Someone there had to know the truth about their arrangement with her. Finding that person was the challenge. I spent an evening researching the company, looking for a weak link in the chain. I found a name on an old press release, David Chen, Vice President of Operations. He had been with the company for 20 years. He seemed like a lifer, a company man. But a little more digging revealed he had recently been passed over for the CEO position in favor of the founder's nephew. A man with a grievance is a man who might be willing to talk. Getting to him was the tricky part. I couldn't just call him. I needed an introduction. I called George. George, do you know a David Chin over at Green Valley? Davy. Sure, I know him, George said. Been my main contact there for years. A straight shooter. Not too happy about the new management, I hear. Bingo. I need to talk to him, George. Off the record. It's about the Willow Creek account. I think the HOA president is getting kickbacks. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Kickbacks, George said, his voice low and angry. That would explain a few things. Their prices for that account are almost 30% higher than for any of their other clients. I always wondered about that. Davy probably knows. Let me make a call. 2 days later, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop in a town 20 miles away. Across the table from me sat David Chen. He was a man in his late 50s, with tired eyes and the weary posture of someone who had been fighting losing battles for too long. "George said you had something important to discuss," he said, stirring his coffee without looking at me. "He also said you're Frank Henderson." He looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "The Crimson Sun Tomato, Frank Henderson. It's an honor. Your work is legendary." "The honor is mine," I said. "And I'm afraid my reason for being here is about the misuse of some of that work." I laid out the story for him. The farm stand, Carol's harassment, the bizarre supply chain, the artificially induced pepper shortage, the recorded phone call. I told him my theory, that Carol was colluding with someone at his company to inflate the price of the produce for the HOA market, and was receiving a portion of that overage as a kickback. He listened intently, his expression growing darker with every detail. When I finished, he stared into his coffee cup for a full minute. "It's worse than you think," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just kickbacks. It's embezzlement. And my new boss, the founder's nephew, is in on it." He then unburdened himself, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. The friend on the board Carol had mentioned was the nephew, a slick young man named Chad. The two of them had cooked up the scheme a year ago. Green Valley would overcharge the HOA, and Chad would approve a monthly, consulting fee, paid to a shell corporation. That corporation, David had discovered after some digging of his own, was registered to Carol's maiden name. "They've skimmed over $50,000 from that community in the last year," David said, his hands trembling slightly. I took my concerns to the founder, but he wouldn't hear a word against his precious nephew. Told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job. "I'm sorry," I said. "That's an impossible position." "I'm done with it," he said, a new fire in his tired eyes. "I've spent 20 years building this company's reputation. I'm not going to stand by and watch this little punk and that suburban tyrant run it into the ground." "What do you need?" This was it. The final, undeniable proof. "I need everything," I said. "The inflated invoices for the Willow Creek account. The payment records for the consulting fee, the incorporation papers for Carol's shell company. Anything you have." He nodded slowly. "It'll cost me my job. Maybe more. It will also expose them," I countered. "And it will save a community from being defrauded by its own leader." He looked at me, a long, searching gaze. "You're not just doing this over a farm stand, are you?" "No," I admitted. "At first, it was. But now, it's about the principle. People like her, they count on good people doing nothing. I'm just tired of doing nothing." He reached across the table and shook my hand. "I'll have a package for you by the end of the week," he said. Armed with the promise of this final proof, I knew I had to move beyond the small-town drama of the HOA. This was no longer a civil matter. This was a criminal conspiracy. Fraud. Embezzlement. Racketeering. I made an appointment with the district attorney's office. I brought my entire file, the stack of fines, the video of Carol's phone call, the clean report from the health inspector, the frivolous lawsuit, and the detailed summary of what my whistleblower was about to provide. I met with a young, sharp-eyed assistant district attorney. She listened to my story with growing astonishment. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "if your contact delivers the documents he promised, this is one of the most open and shut cases of public corruption I've ever seen. We will launch a full investigation." The package from David arrived 3 days later, delivered by a discreet courier. It was a thick manila envelope filled with damning evidence. It was all there, a neat and tidy road map of Carol's greed. I made copies and delivered the originals straight to the DA's office. Now, all the pieces were in place. The trap was not just set, it was ready to be sprung. But I didn't want Carol to be taken down in a quiet office by a couple of detectives. That wasn't justice. That was just process. Justice required an audience. It required the very people she had lorded over and stolen from to witness her fall from grace. Her power was built on a stage of public perception. I was going to bring the whole theater crashing down on her head, during the final act of her own play. The stage for the final showdown was a specially called emergency HOA meeting. Carol had called it herself. The official agenda, posted on the community bulletin board, listed one item: a final vote on legal action against the non-compliant property at 1420 Old Mill Road. That was me. She intended this meeting to be my public execution. She was going to rally her supporters, secure the vote for her lawsuit, and cement her authority once and for all. She had no idea that I had been working with the assistant district attorney to time this perfectly. She had no idea that her final triumph was about to become her public unmasking. I arrived early, taking my usual seat in the back. The room was more crowded than usual. Carol had clearly whipped her supporters into a frenzy. There was a palpable tension in the air, a mix of anger and anticipation. I saw her at the front, whispering conspiratorially with Bob, her loyal second-in-command. She looked confident, smug even. She thought she had me cornered, that my options had run out. She was the predator, moving in for the kill. A few minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, 2 men and a woman in plain business suits entered the room and sat quietly in the chairs nearest the door. They didn't look like Willow Creek residents. They looked serious, watchful. They were detectives from the DA's office. Then, another unexpected guest arrived. A young woman with a notepad and a press pass from the local newspaper. I had made one final call that afternoon, an anonymous tip to the paper's investigative reporter about potential corruption in the Willow Creek HOA. I told her the meeting that night might be newsworthy. Carol saw the reporter and her smug expression faltered for a second. She hated outside scrutiny. But her arrogance quickly reasserted itself. She probably assumed the reporter was there to cover her heroic efforts to protect the community from a rogue farmer. The meeting began. Carol stood and launched into a fiery, pre-rehearsed speech. She painted me as a villain, a stubborn old man who threatened their way of life, their safety, their property values. She spoke of the rule of law and the importance of upholding community standards. It was a masterful performance, full of righteous indignation. Her supporters nodded along, their faces grim. "He has left us with no choice," she concluded, her voice ringing with false regret. "We must authorize this lawsuit to protect our community. I call for a vote." This was my cue. I stood up. "Before you vote," I said, my voice cutting through the applause, "I believe the residents of this community are entitled to some information about how their money is actually being spent." "You are out of order," Carol shrieked. "This is not your meeting." "Oh, but I think it is," I said, walking to the front of the room. I was carrying a small projector and my laptop. "Because this isn't about my farm stand anymore. It's about fraud." I set the projector up and turned it on. An image flashed onto the wall behind Carol's head, a copy of an invoice from Green Valley Provisions to the Willow Creek HOA. "This is an invoice for 1 week's worth of produce for the farmer's market," I explained, my voice calm and steady, like a professor giving a lecture. "As you can see, the total is just over $3,000. I clicked to the next slide. It was the corresponding purchase order from Green Valley to George's farm for the exact same produce. And this is what Green Valley actually paid the farmer for that produce. Just under $2,000. A markup of more than 50%. A bit steep, don't you think? The room was silent. I could feel the mood shifting, the certainty of Carol's supporters beginning to fray. "You might ask, where does all that extra money go?" I continued. "Well, I was curious about that, too." The next slide was a bank statement. It showed a monthly payment of $4,000 from Green Valley Provisions to a shell company called Miller Consulting Services. "This consulting fee is how the money is laundered," I said. "A bogus charge approved by a corrupt executive at the supply company." Carol was ashen. "This is slander." "These are forged documents," she stammered. "Are they?" I asked. I clicked to the final, devastating slide. It was the state registration for Miller Consulting Services. And there, listed as the sole proprietor, was her name, Carol Miller. A collective gasp went through the room. It was the sound of an entire community realizing it had been betrayed. "For over a year," I said, my voice ringing with clarity, "the president of your association has been colluding with a supplier to inflate the price of goods you all buy. She has been taking kickbacks, funneling your money into her own private account. She has skimmed more than $50,000. The lawsuit she wants you to approve against me." It's not to protect the community. It's to silence the person who discovered her crime. I turned off the projector. The silence that followed was deafening. Carol stood frozen for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her world, her carefully constructed kingdom of beige, had just been demolished in front of her subjects. Then, she completely unraveled. "He's lying," she screamed, her voice a raw, hysterical shriek. "It's not a kickback. It's a management fee. A finder's fee. I built that market. I am entitled to be compensated for my work. You people are all so ungrateful." It was a full confession, blurted out in a moment of pure, panicked rage. In her desperation to justify herself, she had admitted to everything. That was the signal the detectives had been waiting for. The three of them stood up and walked calmly to the front of the room. The lead detective flashed his badge. "Carol Miller," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through her tirade. "You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The sight of the detective pulling out a pair of handcuffs broke the spell. Chaos erupted. People were shouting, pointing, the reporter was scribbling furiously in her notepad. Carol stared at the handcuffs as if they were venomous snakes. "You can't do this," she shrieked at the detective. "I am the president of this association." "Not anymore," a resident yelled from the crowd. As the second detective took her arm to place it behind her back, her eyes found mine across the room. They were filled with a terrifying, impotent rage. "You," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You did this. You'll regret this. I'll destroy you. I'll sue you for everything you have." It was her last, hollow threat. A final, pathetic roar from a dethroned queen. The words hung in the air, but they had no power anymore. She was just a common criminal, exposed and defeated. The detectives led her out of the clubhouse, her hysterical threats echoing down the hall until they were cut off by the closing door. The room was left in stunned silence, the residents staring at each other, at me, at the empty space where their leader had just been standing. I packed up my projector. My work was done. The blight, as it turned out, had been removed. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The story of Carol's arrest was on the front page of the local paper the next morning, complete with quotes from her management fee confession at the meeting. The Willow Creek HOA was thrown into the national spotlight for all the wrong reasons. The community, freed from its tyrant, began to heal. The remaining board members, Bob and Martha, resigned in disgrace. An emergency election was held, and a new board of decent, reasonable people was voted in. Their first official act was to issue a formal, public apology to me and to drop the frivolous lawsuit. Their second act was to pass a new bylaw, which they jokingly called the Henderson Act, officially exempting small-scale agricultural sales from any and all HOA oversight. The community began to change. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and petty rules vanished, replaced by a genuine sense of neighborliness. People started planting more colorful flowers. Kids' basketball hoops, once forbidden, appeared at the ends of driveways. The beige facade had cracked, and real life was starting to bloom. As for Carol, her downfall was absolute. Faced with the mountain of evidence against her and David Chen's testimony, she and her co-conspirator, Chad, took a plea deal. She was convicted of felony fraud and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. The court ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, forcing the sale of her oversized beige house. She lost everything, her home, her freedom, and the social status she had valued above all else. She had tried to declare my small patch of earth a blight, and in the end, her own life was the one that was razed to the ground. The HOA approached me a month after the dust settled. The new president, a kind woman I'd often seen at my stand, asked if I would be willing to run the official community farmers market. Properly this time, she said with a smile. With real local farmers. I agreed. We tore down the old, artificial market and rebuilt it from the ground up. I invited George and a dozen other small, local growers to participate. We turned it into a true celebration of the region's bounty. My little farm stand at the end of the drive became the anchor, the heart of a new, honest enterprise. I stood there on the opening day of the new market, watching families laugh and chat, their baskets overflowing with real, fresh food. Children ran through the grass, their mouths stained with strawberry juice. The air was filled with the smell of fresh bread, grilled corn, and community. I had come to this place seeking peace, a quiet refuge from a world that had taken too much from me. Instead, I had been drawn into a war I never wanted to fight. But in fighting it, I had found something I hadn't even realized I was looking for. I had found a purpose beyond my own grief. I had found a community worth protecting. I never set out to be a hero. I was just a man who wanted to be left alone to tend his garden. But I learned that sometimes, the only way to protect your peace is to be willing to go to war for it. You can't let the bullies and the tyrants win, because their blight, if left unchecked, will eventually choke out everything that's good and decent in the world. Sometimes, you have to stand your ground, cultivate your evidence, and wait for the right season. Because in the end, no matter how carefully it's planned or how ruthlessly it's executed, a crooked harvest will never, ever bear fruit. And the truth, like the sun, will always find a way to break through the clouds.